Hey everyone, this is Gravity Bowmain, and this is an in-depth dive on Vogue hands performance. So hand performance is one of the 5 elements of Vogue Femme. When we're talking about hand performance, we're really talking about telling a story of fluidity, a story of femininity, and a story that can be received by the audience and understood. And that story comes about through movements of the wrist, the arm, the shoulder, and the fingers, and it all comes together to kind of create that sort of narrative dance. There is a little bit of a discrepancy between hand performance as a category and hand performance as an element in Vogue Femme. Really it just comes down to the fact that within Vogue Femme you can and should do hand performance while moving around and while doing other elements, whereas in the context of hand performance as a category, it's something that's stationary or seated and it's done by itself. So when we're talking about hand performance, it's also really crucial to remember musicality. Musicality means that you're attaching the moves that you do to the beat that you hear. So if the beat goes doom doo doom doom doom, your hands are going doom doo doom doom doom, or whatever the case is. And that's really fundamental to hand performance, especially because hand performance is one of the elements that most easily allows you to play with the more complex parts of the beat as opposed to just the simple 1, 2, 3, 4, which might be more suited to a catwalk or a duck walk. When we talk about hands performance, we're really talking about a bunch of different sub-techniques. So we're talking about taps, lines, waves, circles, and figure eights. Let's break that down. So first we have taps. Taps are super fundamental to hands performance, and they're also really easy. Taps are literally just tapping. You're tapping your body, you're tapping the space around you, you're tapping anything that really helps you tell that story. Taps are a really crucial tool for musicality. Because it's one of the easiest things to directly translate. If the beat goes goom, 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 you can just go goom, 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 goom with taps, and it really sort of achieves the same thing. So with taps, you can tap outside of your body, you can tap on your body, you can tap pretty much anywhere and in any kind of variation, and it's going to create a story. Next part of hand performance is lines. So lines are exactly what they sound like. They're straight lines, sometimes with a bent wrist, sometimes with a straight wrist. And in a hand performance for Vogue Femme specifically, what they kind of serve at is either an ending point or kind of an inflection point. What I mean by that is the rest of your hand performance might be quite flowy. So if you're flowing all around, then you use this line to kind of reset and to create a structure that the audience can understand. That sort of grounds the rest of your performance, if that makes sense. If you only had these flowy, complex movements, sometimes it feels a little disconnected, but if you use lines, especially on like crashes or loud noises in the music, it can really help kind of connect and create more sort of basic concepts that are more easily understood by the audience, as opposed to just kind of like this whirlwind of hands that goes all over the place. The next thing to talk about is waves. Unlike in other dance forms, waves are not this kind of like strong, isolated like arm movement. In Vogue, waves are really just waving your hands, waving your fingers. So it can be something as simple as this or like this. Waves are a great transition element of hands. What I mean by that is it helps you get from one place in space to a next. So if you go out and you're trying to come back in, you can wave back in. It's something more like that. And you can use waves in tandem with other parts of hand performance as well. Next we have circles. Circles are kind of exactly what they sound like. They're creating circles, but you can be really inventive with them. You don't have to just make circles with your wrists. You can do circles with your fingers, you can do circles with your elbows, and you can even do circles with your entire arm. And combining those in interesting ways is what's going to give your performance texture and give it movement and things like that. The last part of hand performance that's really crucial to understand is figure eights. I do want to make it clear that figure eights are maybe not as important as a lot of people think they are. Yes, they are really important to hand performance, and they're something I use all the time, but I think in the context of people not from the ballroom scene who try and Vogue, I think there's this sort of over-applied importance on like, oh, I'm going to do a figure eight above my head for 2 entire 8 counts, and that's just something you don't normally see in actual ballroom, so I just wanted to make that clear. But in terms of an actual figure eight, what it is creating this motion that sort of creates this illusion of kind of this really fast and like contorted sort of movement that really helps to accent the like kind of beat killy, really fast parts of the music. So Figure eights can occur in front of you, they can occur over the head, they can occur really around anywhere, but their main purpose in actual Vogue Femme hand performance, I find, is really more as a transition. So in the same way that waves can be used as a transition, figure eights can too. So if I'm over here, I can use a figure eight to go here, and it really sort of creates this visual interest when you're trying to move throughout space. And it isn't necessarily something that you have to do for a long time or something that you have to do without any other elements alongside it. In terms of the actual mechanics of doing a figure eight, it's one of the things that's pretty confusing for beginners to learn, so I'm going to go over it briefly, but I do have other videos specifically about this as well. The easiest way to learn is to either imagine tracing an 8 with one hand and then follow it with your other hand. This is really good for a lot of beginners. Another way to learn is to put your hands in a lotus position and bring them down so the back of your wrists are touching each other like so, and then bring them back up. This helps a lot of people, but it also can get kind of confusing with the wrist. But sometimes it helps to do this exercise facing the mirror or facing a camera. So if I do here and I have my palms out like this, and then as I turn around, my hands flips and now the back of my wrists are facing the camera, and then I just repeat this. This is another way to get that same figure eight motion. In terms of figure eight variations, putting them on top of the head and everything else, those are all kind of individual things, but just to briefly go over this, because I see it a lot and I see a lot of people doing it wrong, you want to have your hands directly on top of your head and not floating over here. And when you're doing this, you kind of want to have your hands come in front of your face if possible, and it's really going to kind of contour that face and create a sort of illusion that isn't gained by just keeping them over your head like this. So that's really, really key. So now you know the basic components of hand performance. Let's talk about putting them together to create your performance. There's a lot of different combinations that you can use, and it's really limitless with your own imagination. But just to give you a few ideas, you could start doing taps and then start circling out, then wave back in, then do some more taps, and then go to a figure eight to bring it above the head to come down like that. Just anything like that is really about hand performance, but you can see how I'm using these different elements of hands and I'm stringing them together in a way that is fluid and that tells a story. This is something that you just kind of have to get used to yourself. There's no hard and fast rules about like, oh, you need to wave after you do a circle and then you need to tap. It's really about learning how your body moves and how your body flows through that movement using these tools. In terms of ways to make your hand performance more complex or more interesting, one great tool to use is the idea of compound movement versus symmetry. What I mean by that is compound movement might be where both of your hands are doing something different at the same time, where symmetry is both of your hands doing the same thing. Both of these are really important tools, but they give very different effects. With symmetry, you have pretty simple movement. Whatever you're doing with one hand, you do with the other. So this would be symmetry, right? You're doing the same thing with your left and your right hands. You're just swapping the direction. On the other hand, when we talk about compound movement, you could be doing circles with one hand and taps with the other, like this, or some other variation where you're doing not the same thing with both hands, or you are doing the same element, but you're going in different directions. That's really what's going to give you variation in your hands and make them more visually interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about storytelling, because we've been mentioning it a lot, but I haven't really given any concrete examples. Storytelling is something that can be either very, very literal or a little bit more abstract. In the literal sense, you can very much think of a story and act it out with your hands like you're doing charades or anything else. I mean, the most common example that we saw in Paris is Burning is like, oh, I'm doing my makeup and now I'm closing it and I'm giving it to you. All of that is an example of literal storytelling, and you can do any kind of variation on that. You could do your hair, you could, get ready for something, you could cook and like chop vegetables and do whatever you want. That's a very, very valid way of doing hand performance, but you can also be a little bit more abstract if you want. Something that I like to do is just imagine like kind of a concept, or imagine sort of a state of mind, or embody a sort of character, and then just move in that kind of imagined space. So it doesn't necessarily have to be as literal, where it's not like, oh, I'm a knight saving a princess in a tower and now I'm scaling the tower. It can be something just as simple as like, I want to embody kind of this more watery, like ocean feel or something, and then a lot of your moves can sort of reflect maybe sort of more wavy and like kind of aquatic things, or like maybe like sort of like fish type fin motions. And it's something that is like, it can be happening just entirely in your head. It doesn't even need to be super like readable in the sense where people are going to be like, oh yeah, they're in the ocean. But it's more about like having that character is going to add a sort of intention to your movement and a sort of quality to it that's people are going to be able to tell even if they don't know exactly what you're trying to embody. So let's talk about when you actually do hand performance in the context of walking a ball. Something that I see a lot with beginners is that they'll start off with just hand performance, standing and just doing it real quick, and then getting into the rest of their performance, and then we never see it again. I think this is really obvious, and it really makes a lot of sense for people because it can seem as like a good ramp up to the rest of your performance, but I also think it's really, really important that you're incorporating hand performance with the rest of your elements, and you're incorporating it throughout your performance. If hand performance is about storytelling, you should be telling that story through the entirety of your tens or through the entirety of a battle, not just at the very beginning to get people used to it, if that makes sense. In terms of what that actually looks like in practice, it can be something like if you're doing a catwalk, instead of doing catwalk hands, you can do something that's more hand performance-esque. So maybe you're doing a catwalk and then you start doing a figure 8 while you're still doing catwalks or something like that. Or in a less complex sense, you can literally just be like sinking to the floor and doing hand performance and then transitioning that into a dip. Really what I mean with this is that anytime you are moving, you can be doing hands. Obviously there are times where it could look super busy and distracted and you don't want that either, but really be creative in how you use it and don't just think you're limited to standing there and just moving your hands and then starting to do something else. It's going to make your performance feel a little choppy, and it's going to make it feel a little bit like you're like going down a checklist of the elements rather than giving an actual full body performance. Let's talk about a few tips and tricks for hand performance. The first is be careful about mixing other styles. I think a lot of people come to Vogue with backgrounds in other dance styles, especially other street styles, and it's very tempting when you're starting off to use elements of things that you already know from other things, whether that's waving or popping or tutting or whacking or anything else. And those things are not inherently a problem or inherently wrong, and it's not like they have no space in Vogue hand performance at all. But it's really, really important to be careful with how you use them, and it's important to do everything within the context of Vogue. So if you're going to add, say, a popping element to your hand performance, make sure it makes sense. Maybe you do like a whole figure 8 and wave situation, and then you get to here, and then on the crash you like hit, and it activates something else. That can definitely make sense in the context of Vogue, but you have to make sure that you're not just relying on things you already know, or foregoing actual elements of Vogue hand performance in favor of just doing a style that you're already comfortable with. Another really important tip is to do everything on both sides. This is true for all elements, but for hands, it's something that I definitely fell into early on, where I only did figure 8s one direction, and I only would do more intricate things with my right hand as opposed to my left hand. And when you start falling into that trap, sometimes you'll be in situations where it only really makes sense for you to go the other direction, and your body won't really be able to do it, or it won't be able to do it as easily or as fluidly. So it's really important to practice everything both ways. If you learn a combo, challenge yourself by reversing it and doing everything you did with your right hand with your left hand and vice versa. So another really important tip for hand performance is to be careful about your fingers. It's not something that you can necessarily lay strict rules to, where it's like, oh, your third finger has to always lead or anything like that. It's more like you need to keep a sort of looseness and delay in your hands and in your fingers. So what I mean by that is if my move is to go over here, my fingers kind of arrive last, and they do so in a way that's very sort of soft and doesn't really produce any energy in and of themselves. They're more just kind of like reacting to the movement of the arm around them. And you kind of want to keep that sort of loose sort of motion with your fingers throughout, because it's really going to add that air of softness and that air of femininity that's really, really crucial with Vogue femme hands. My final tip is something we've discussed a little before, but musicality is key. It's really important to think about what moves work with what beat patterns. So if you have a really fast beat pattern, that's like a 5e and a 6e and a situation, something like a figure 8 can be really appropriate there, because it's that same kind of really fast movement that creates this sort of illusion and this sort of energy that matches that speed. Whereas if you have like a very methodical, like 1, 2, 3, 4, something like taps are more appropriate. And it's something that you really have to play with on your own, but try and work with things like drum beats, things that have these really complex and layered sort of rhythms to them, and see how you would play with them in the context of Vogue hand performance, and it's really going to help you elevate your performance and tie it more to the music. Remember also that if we're talking about a ballroom context, you also have the musicality of the commentation, and that's equally as important, and it's something that's really easy to pick up on with hands, and it's really effective when you do. Thank you all for watching this tutorial. My goal with these videos really is to create a set of accessible and decent quality Vogue videos out there that people who maybe have less access to a ballroom scene can learn from and ask questions and things like that. If you do want to support me in that goal, my payment links are down below, and I've also linked a number of charities that focus on Black trans women. Without Black trans women, we would not have Vogue Femme, we would not have the ballroom scene. So it's super, super important that we remember that and give back to those communities as well. That said, also if you want to take more classes from me, I do have Vimeo links in the description. My Vimeo classes are $5, but if payment is an issue, you can DM me and I will give you a free access code. I do my best to be as responsive on that as possible. And if you do have local ballroom scenes in your area or people from the ballroom scene who teach Vogue, I highly encourage you to take their classes. Learning from as many teachers as possible is really, really important, and it's going to give you a well-rounded style and a well-rounded background for you to create your own style from. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments below and I will do my best to respond to them. If you want to see more content like this and see the rest of the series as I release it, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, and my other socials will also be linked down below. Thank you.